you were taught that Mary was a grown woman. Not always explicitly, Nobody sat you down and said the words, but that's what you absorbed. The nativity scenes, the oil paintings, the stained glass windows of every church you ever walked into. A serene woman in blue, maybe in her mid-20s, holding an infant with a calm, knowing smile. Dignified, settled, complete. A mother who had chosen this role, not a girl who had been chosen for it. That image is so deeply wired into the Western religious imagination that most people have never stopped to ask where it came from or what it's covering up. J.J. Benitez spent decades pulling at exactly these threads. The places where the official picture is a little too clean, a little too convenient, a little too comfortable to have arrived at by accident. And this is one of those places. Because here's what the historical record actually says. Mary was almost certainly between 12 and 14 years old when she became pregnant. Not a woman, not a young adult, a child by any modern standard. And the reason you weren't told that in Sunday school, the reason your textbook pictured someone who looked like she could have been your teacher's age instead of your own, that reason is not simple. It is deeply, surprisingly human. And by the end of this, that reason is going to change how you see the whole story. Not diminish it, expand it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There are layers here. And the last one is the one nobody wants to say out loud. Before we go further, if this kind of history is what you're here for, the real context behind the stories you thought you knew, the subscription is how you tell the algorithm to keep bringing it to you. I've got a lot more ground to cover, and the further down we go, the more uncomfortable it gets, in the best possible way. Now, let's start where everyone starts. The version that most people carry looks something like this. Mary was a young woman, not a teenager, but a mature young adult, who received the Annunciation and, being a person of deep faith, said yes. She was betrothed to Joseph, an older man, but the marriage hadn't yet been consummated. She was of appropriate age. She was ready. The whole event is presented, in everything from church sermons to Hollywood films, as something that happened to a person with full adult capacity, full adult understanding, and the full emotional equipment to process what was being asked of her. That's the version. And it isn't entirely without basis. The canonical Gospels, Matthew and Luke, give no age at all. 0. The text is completely silent on that specific detail. So if you grew up thinking the silence meant she was a grown woman, that's not your fault. That's not even really a mistake. It's what the art told you for 2,000 years. It's what the tradition reinforced so thoroughly, so consistently, so beautifully. Those paintings are genuinely beautiful. That the assumption became invisible. It stopped being an assumption and started being just the way things were. But here's the thing about invisible assumptions. They are still assumptions. And this one collapses the moment you look at what historians actually know about the world Mary lived in. First century Judea was an agricultural society. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was brutal, resources were tight, the economy of survival ran on labor, and families were structured around it with a clarity that we, living in a world of extended adolescence and emotional maturity benchmarks, find genuinely difficult to imagine. And the customs around marriage and betrothal reflected that reality in ways that are jarring to read today, not because those customs were evil by their own internal standard, but because they operated on a completely different timeline than anything we'd recognize now. Michael Satlow, a historian who spent years studying Jewish marriage practices in Antiquity, documented this in rigorous academic detail. His conclusion, drawn from the full body of evidence available about ancient Palestinian Jewish society, women were typically married in their mid to late teens, often shortly after the onset of puberty. The social and biological logic was unsentimental. A family's daughter was a resource in the most practical sense of that word. A betrothal agreement was an economic arrangement between families as much as anything else. The The timing followed the body, not any modern conception of emotional readiness or psychological development. That's not Satlow editorializing. That's the documented norm of the world Mary was born into. But if you want primary documentation, and I do because the historical record matters more than anyone's interpretation of it, you go to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a foundational legal text of Judaism, compiled around the year 200, but codifying oral laws that had been in active practice for centuries before that compilation. It is not a radical document. It is not a polemical document. It is a careful record of how the law actually worked. And in tractate Kiddushin and tractate Niddah, the Mishnah describes with legal precision the age and circumstances under which a father could formally betroth his daughter. The term used for a girl of this age is ketannah. A minor, a girl under 12 years and 1 day old. The law permitted betrothal at that age, not as an exception, not as something unusual that required special justification, as the codified, normalized, legally ordinary framework of the tradition. Let that settle for a moment, because we are not talking about rumors. We are not talking about anti-religious polemic or historical revisionism designed to discredit the faith. We are talking about the primary legal text of the tradition that Mary herself was born into, raised inside of, and lived within every single day of her life. The legal framework of her own world permitted and normalized betrothal at the age of a ketannah. She was not an exception to the customs of first-century Judea. She was, in all likelihood, precisely within them. And now, here is where the first layer really comes off. Because once you understand the legal framework, once you accept that the documented, codified practice of Mary's own world involved betrothal at ages we today would not accept under any circumstances, the next question becomes, where does the specific number come from? 12, 13, 14. Why those specific ages? The answer to that is partly in the Mishnah, partly in the stone. Archaeological epigraphy, the study of inscriptions carved into stone, onto tombs, onto public monuments, from the Greco-Roman Jewish world gives us something rare, actual cross-referenced data on real marriage ages, drawn from physical records rather than legal ideals. Tombstone inscriptions and burial records compiled and analyzed by historians of the ancient Mediterranean place the average age of first marriage for girls in first-century Judea at around 13 to 14 years old. Not as an outlier case, not as an extreme, as the arithmetic average for the documented population. Think about what that means for the probability distribution. If 13 to 14 was the average, then there were girls marrying younger, and there were girls marrying older. Mary, within that distribution, was entirely ordinary, unremarkable by the standards of her world. A girl of 12 or 13 being betrothed in first-century Galilee was not a tragedy, not a scandal, not even something anyone in her community would have paused to comment on. It was Tuesday. And then there's the Protoevangelium of James. The Protoevangelium is a non-canonical early Christian text written somewhere between 150 and 200 CE, meaning within living memory of a living memory of the events it claims to describe. It is not in your Bible. The Church eventually excluded it from the official canon, and that exclusion matters. But so does what the text actually contains. Because before that exclusion, the Protoevangelium was widely read, widely circulated, and powerfully influential on the way that early Christians understood and visualized and told the nativity story. It is the source of details that are now deeply embedded in Christian devotional tradition. Details about Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna, about her presentation in the temple, about her upbringing. And the Protoevangelium is explicit about one thing in particular. It depicts Mary as 12 years old at the time of her betrothal to Joseph. 12. The text that shaped centuries of early Christian imagination. The text that was read aloud in communities across the ancient Mediterranean world before it was officially sidelined. The text that fed the visual tradition that eventually produced those paintings. That text put her age at 12. and nobody in those early communities seems to have found that number surprising. But the Protoevangelium's exclusion from the canon is worth pausing on because it tells you something about the process of editing. The early church had good stated reasons for setting it aside. The document was considered theologically unreliable in certain respects, and the Canon Committee had concerns about its late composition date relative to the events it described. All of that is historically accurate. But it is also true that the text they set aside was the one that said 12. The texts that remained canonical were the ones that said nothing at all, and silence, in a tradition that would go on to fill that silence with paintings of a woman in her mid-20s, is not the same as neutrality. The silence was an invitation, and the tradition accepted it enthusiastically. For those who ask whether claiming Mary was 12 or 13 is just anti-Christian spin designed to make the Nativity look bad, the answer is no, and the reasons for that no are important. The 12 to 14 range does not come from polemicists. It comes from the Mishnah, which is a Jewish legal text that predates Christian interpretation entirely. It comes from the Tombstone records of Mary's own community. It comes from a widely circulated early Christian text that was read in communities of faith for centuries. The tradition itself produced the documentation. What historians did was simply refuse to look away from it. Now hold everything you just absorbed, because this is the moment where most people think they've arrived at the full picture. 12 or 13 or 14. Historical norm. Ancient world, ancient customs. Understood, case closed, but wait, that's not the third layer. The third layer is not about the age. The third layer is about what we chose to do with it. And here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The paintings didn't happen by accident. The serene woman in blue, painted somewhere in her mid-20s by Raphael, by Fra Angelico, by Leonardo, holding the divine child with a calm that suggests she fully understood and freely elected this role. That image was a choice, a deliberate choice made over centuries by a tradition that needed the story to be emotionally manageable. And I understand that impulse. I taught this material for 12 years in a Catholic high school in Evansville, Indiana, and I never once used the word child in reference to Mary. Never once. Not because I was dishonest, because the image I had absorbed, the same one you absorbed, simply didn't leave room for the truth. The curriculum didn't ask for it. The diocese certainly didn't ask for it. And, to be honest, neither did the parents of my students. I was 17 years into my faith before I first encountered the Mishnah's legal framework in an academic context, in a university library 2 blocks from campus, on a Tuesday afternoon when I should have been grading papers. I sat there for a long time after reading it, not angry, not scandalized, just quiet. Because the version I had been teaching suddenly had a very specific thing missing from it, and the missing piece was not a footnote. It was the historical reality of the person the story was about. I didn't quit that same week, but I started to understand that I would eventually have to. Here's what the third layer actually is. The tradition didn't sanitize Mary's age because it was careless or ignorant. The scholars in the early church, who eventually sidelined the Protoevangelium, knew what was in it. The medieval theologians who commissioned the paintings knew the historical debates about Mary's age. Those debates were ongoing in the scholarly literature long before the Renaissance artists ever picked up a brush. The decision to depict Mary as a serene woman in her mid-20s was not made in ignorance. It was made in full awareness of what the alternative looked like. And the alternative, a 12 or 13-year-old girl, a ketannah by the legal standard of her own tradition, in a world that the Mishnah describes with the unsentimental clarity of a legal code, being told that she is carrying the Son of God. That alternative produces a theological problem that is very, very hard to preach around. Because if she was a child, then the question of what it means to say yes shifts completely. An adult woman saying yes to the Annunciation is exercising mature agency. A child saying yes exists in a world where the concept of fully free choice is already complicated by law, by social structure, by the power dynamics of a father who could betroth her without her formal consent, by the sheer weight of divine authority arriving in the voice of an angel. A child saying yes asks questions that the tradition found genuinely difficult to answer without undermining the theological framework that depended on her willingness being pure and uncoerced. So the tradition did what traditions do when confronted with a truth that creates problems. It slowly, over centuries, without ever quite saying so out loud, made her older. Not in the official doctrine, not in a formal declaration, in the art, in the sermons, in the Sunday school flannel boards, in the gradual cultural drift of depiction that is far more powerful than any theological statement because it operates below the threshold of critical scrutiny. You didn't believe Mary was a grown woman because someone told you to believe it. You believed it because you saw it 10,000 times before you were old enough to question it. That is how these things work. And it worked beautifully for 2,000 years. Go back for a second to that image you started with. The serene woman in blue, mid-20s, calm, knowing. You didn't inherit that image as an argument. You inherited it as visual furniture, background knowledge so basic that it never even occurred to you to examine it. You were taught that Mary was a grown woman. And you were, but nobody ever said so explicitly, because the most effective instruction never announces itself. Now you see what that image was doing. It wasn't reverence, it was management. And the real Mary, the historically plausible Mary, the girl that the Mishnah's legal framework and the Tombstone records and the Protoevangelium of James all point toward, that Mary is harder to look at. Not because she is less worthy of reverence, because she requires a different kind of reverence, one that doesn't look away from the full weight of what the story is asking you to take seriously. A girl of 13 or 14 in first century Galilee was not, by her own world's standard, a tragedy. She was a legal person, a betrothed person, a person whose life was already substantially determined by law and custom and the decisions of the adult men around her. She was not waiting for her 20s to begin her life. By the standards of her world, her life had already begun in earnest. And into that life, into that specific, historically ordinary life, in a village in first century Judea, inside a legal framework that the Mishnah describes without sentiment, something entirely extraordinary arrived. And she said, yes. I want you to sit with what that yes costs when you refuse to look away from the context. The yes that gets preached, the yes of the composed woman in the Renaissance painting, is a beautiful yes. It's the yes of someone who has the emotional and spiritual resources to understand what is being asked and to elect it freely. It's a yes that is easy to celebrate, easy to paint, easy to preach on the fourth Sunday of Advent every year without anyone leaving the church feeling disturbed. The yes of a girl of 13 or 14 in a world where her own legal status was that of a ketannah under her father's authority, where deviation from the social norm carried consequences that were severe and concrete, where the voice speaking to her was not a human voice, that yes asks a completely different set of questions about agency, about context, about what the story is actually claiming happened and what that means. The historical Mary's yes is harder to hold, and also, I think, infinitely more extraordinary, because a composed adult choosing in full clarity is choosing. But a girl in the middle of childhood, whose world operated by the logic the Mishnah describes, who had every reason to be terrified and no institutional framework to explain what was happening to her, that girl's yes, if we take the story seriously, is not a theological abstraction. It is something almost unbearable to look at directly, and unbearable in a way that, if you let it land, is far more demanding of your respect than the version that was edited for your comfort. That's not a scandal. That's the actual story, and it was taken from you, not maliciously, but consistently, over a very long time. I want to take a moment here, because this kind of material doesn't come cheap or easy. The research, the sourcing, the care required to talk about something like this without tipping into sensationalism on one side or false comfort on the other. That is the work this channel exists to do. If what you've found here has given you something you couldn't find in a mainstream documentary or a Sunday homily, the Super Thanks button is a direct and concrete way to make it possible for me to keep going. This investigation continues because people like you signal that it matters. And it does matter. These aren't academic questions for their own sake. They're the questions that determine whether the tradition you inherited taught you something real or something managed. You're not just a viewer, you're the reason this exists. So, the question that remains, and I think it has to remain at least for a while, is this. What does it mean for everything else that the tradition felt it needed to do this? Because this was not a one-time editorial decision. This was a 2,000-year project of systematic emotional management. Mary's age is one data point in a much larger pattern. If the physical reality of the woman at the center of the nativity story required adjustment, if the historical record about her age was too uncomfortable to transmit faithfully, and was therefore quietly corrected upward over centuries of art and preaching and theological instruction, then what does that tell you about the trustworthiness of the tradition's transmission of everything else? I'm not saying everything is wrong. I'm not saying the tradition is evil. I spent 12 years teaching inside that tradition, and most of the people I worked with were sincere and careful and genuinely trying to do something good. But sincerity is not a substitute for accuracy. And the pattern of editing, of taking the historical reality of the first century and adjusting it until it was emotionally safe for the 21st, that pattern has consequences. It means that when you go looking for the actual people at the center of the actual events, you have to dig through layers of accumulated comfort to get to them. This channel is about the digging. I think about the students I taught in Evansville. Some of them were 13 or 14 years old themselves, sitting in my classroom looking at textbook images of Mary with the calm, knowing face of a woman a decade older than they were. And there was, somewhere beneath the lesson plan and the diocesan curriculum and everything I was authorized to say, a fact I never mentioned. The historical Mary was probably their exact age, not older than them, not wiser than them in any way that 2,000 years of depicted serenity would suggest. She was them, a girl their age, in a world nothing like theirs, in a situation nothing in either of their worlds had any framework to prepare anyone for. What knowing that would have done to those students, I genuinely don't know. I think about it. I think about it a lot. What I do know is that the version they got, the version I gave them, the one I had been given in turn, did something specific to them. It made the story feel like it happened to someone fundamentally different from them. Someone already prepared for the sacred. Someone whose yes was not a rupture in an ordinary life, but the natural expression of an extraordinary nature that had been building for decades. The real version says something different. It says the sacred landed in the middle of an entirely ordinary life, in the body of an entirely ordinary girl, living by the entirely ordinary legal and social customs of her completely specific historical world. And that ordinary girl said something that changed everything. That version requires more of the listener. It doesn't let you file the story under things that happen to exceptional people in exceptional circumstances. It plants the question uncomfortably close to you, to your own ordinary life, to the gap between what you were handed and what was actually there. And here is why that proximity matters in ways that go beyond historical curiosity. If you grew up with any relationship to this tradition, practicing or lapsed or skeptical or somewhere in between, there is a version of this story living in you right now that you have never consciously chosen to believe. You absorbed it. You were shown it before you had the analytical tools to evaluate it. And that absorbed version has been doing work in the background of your religious imagination, shaping what feels sacred and what feels too strange to be sacred, determining which questions seem worth asking and which seem inappropriate to raise. What this channel is trying to do, what J.J. Benitez spent his career trying to do, is not to destroy that background. It's to make it visible. because you cannot examine what you cannot see, and you cannot decide what to keep and what to let go of until you know, specifically and concretely, what you were actually given versus what the evidence actually shows. The sanitized Mary is not just a historical inaccuracy, she is a template, a model for how sacred figures are allowed to be understood, comfortable, composed, safely beyond the reach of real questions. And every time that template was reinforced, in a painting, in a homily, in a textbook, in a classroom in Evansville, Indiana, it trained you to accept a certain distance between the official version and the truth as normal, as pious even, as the respectful way to hold sacred things. It is not respectful, it is comfortable, and those are different things. And I think that's exactly why it got edited out. The version that was convenient had a function. It kept the story at a safe, emotional distance. It made the people in it feel like figures in a painting, which eventually is literally what they became. Beautiful, precise, frozen, and just slightly beyond reach. The truth is smaller and messier and closer. A teenage girl in a village in Galilee. The law of her world codified in a text most Christians have never read. The archaeological record of her community preserved in stone. An early Christian text that was set aside, possibly in part because of what it revealed about her age. And a yes that nobody who knew her background, her world, her legal status, her age would have predicted. That is the story. The full one. The one with all the layers still on it. The question for you is what you do with it. Whether it shakes your faith or deepens it, whether it makes the tradition feel dishonest or makes Mary feel real for the first time, that's not something I can answer for you. It wasn't something I could answer for myself in that library on that Tuesday afternoon. It took a long time, but I'd rather have the question than the painting. Which layer hit hardest for you? Leave it in the comments. And if you want to keep going deeper, into the texts, the documents, the places where the official story and the historical record diverge in ways that matter, this is the channel for that. Stick around. There's a lot more ground to cover, and I've got nowhere else I'd rather be digging.